A mother fears the worst when she can't get a hold of her daughter for several days.
I was ringing her bell, and she never came. So I called the police, and they came.
Inside, they find the recent college graduate dead from gunshot wounds.
She was shot in the head twice, and we only had one casing, which made us believe the person had cleaned up the scene.
Somebody's trying to hide what they did.
She's so caring. Who would do this to her?
The police search for an answer.
There were so many rumors going on, horrible rumors.
That's crazy. They just really put my name in that. Wow.
Yeah, well, that's what we're here to clear up.
As a trans woman, a lot of people were interested in what was happening.
It could be a crime of passion. It could be a hate crime.
Or was it a cold-blooded murder?
This was a calculated act of violence.
You could be with somebody for a whole decade and not really know who they are.
She went to sleep trusting this person.
We were warned long ago that love is blind.
May 31st, 2022. It's Tuesday in Albany, New York, the capital of the Empire State. But there's nothing imperial about the town itself.
Albany is known as Small Albany because it's got like a small town feel. It's lots of festivals and fairs. It's very close-knit.
Albany's a nice area, a lot of history in this city.
But this morning, one of the city's residents, a Sid Hemingway Powell, has mysteriously gone silent.
I called her Sunday. She didn't answer, so I'm like, maybe she just wants some time to herself.
Sid was known for just dropping off the radar. Sometimes she just needed peace of mind.
But after 2 more days of silence, Jackie Powell is starting to get worried.
I kept calling her, and she's not answering her phone.
She hadn't heard from her since the 27th.
So she decides to go to her daughter's apartment.
Sid, it's Mom. Are you there?
I was ringing her bell, and she never came.
When there's no response, she calls the Albany police.
Jackie Powell called for a welfare check on her daughter.
Officers from our patrol division responded out there along with building management to access her apartment.
Oh, these are nasty. This will get you into the world.
So just get us in now.
Yeah.
But it turns out they don't need a key.
When they got to her specific apartment, it was unlocked. It was closed, but it was unlocked.
The patrol officer tells Jackie and the property manager to wait outside.
They told me, we can't just let you in.
The patrol officer walked in. Nothing seemed in disarray or out of the ordinary. She's calling out Sid's name, trying to get some response.
Are you in here, Sid?
He goes to the back bedroom, and Sid is on her bed. She looks like she's sleeping.
But as the officer approaches her, he quickly realizes this is a sleep that she'll never wake up from.
Sid was unfortunately located deceased.
But Jackie's daughter isn't just dead. She's been murdered.
Sid had been shot in the head twice.
"30-year-old Sid Hemingway Powell had been a fighter all her life.
She don't mean any harm to nobody. She fights for love. She fights for her friends, her family.
And she did it with style.
Sid was always super outgoing and everything. She always had a lot of friends.
For Sid, the excitement never stopped.
Sid was the life of the party. Sid and I both loved to dance, but Sid will always try to outdo everyone, including myself.
Sid was like a wild child, but in a good way.
As she got older, Sid started participating in modeling shows, rapping, and performing on YouTube.
She performed under the name Chum Chum, and everybody loved it. She had a real talent for it.
And she dreamed of making a difference.
Sid wanted to change the world, and she believed that it started with you. We have to make the change.
Also a diligent student, Sid earned an associate's degree at a community college. But she wasn't finished.
She enrolled at the University of Albany. She wanted to get her degree to become a physician's assistant and then go on to become a doctor.
She wanted to help people. That was her thing.
In 2022, she graduated with a degree in biology.
Whatever challenges came her way, she was able to go beyond that because she was empowered to make a difference, not just for herself, but also for her community.
She was just amazing. She's the type of person that if you say, I'm going to the moon, she's gonna read up on it, we're gonna build this rocket, you could do it.
They celebrated her graduation with a party where she was surrounded by all those that loved her.
It was always just nothing but love at the end of the day.
But now,
Sid?
Only a few days after the happy occasion, Sid has been found murdered in her apartment.
Sid had sustained 2 gunshot wounds to her head.
She was beyond help.
The officer comes outside and tells her mom, Jackie, that Sid had passed away.
Did you find her?
Ma'am?
He was like, she's deceased. I just started crying.
Despite the shock, Sid's mother wants to help.
Do you have any idea who may have done something like this?
Nobody.
She was popular with all of Albany.
But Jackie Powell does tell police she was always afraid something like this might happen.
Why is that?
She was trans.
This might be a hate crime.
30-year-old Sid Hemingway Powell seemed destined for success.
She just graduated with a biology degree and was looking forward to starting her medical career as a physician's assistant.
Sid has so many goals that she wanted to achieve.
But now, after not hearing from her for a few days, Sid's worried mother has asked police to do a welfare check on her.
Albany police went to Sid's apartment and, upon making entry, located Sid, deceased. She was shot in the head twice.
Sid's mother tells the police that in the back of her mind, she'd always feared something like this might happen.
Her mother had worried about her safety because Sid was transgender.
Is that why she was murdered?
We wondered, was this going to be some kind of hate crime?
Or there could be a more personal motive.
Did somebody just not like her? We don't know what happened.
Was this an event where someone had met someone at a bar and went home and then was surprised that someone was trans? That was a fear.
As Sid's mother is taken to the station for a formal statement, homicide detectives arrive to begin the investigation.
Myself and Detective O'Donovan went to Sid's house and began to process and work the scene.
They start with the victim.
She was located in bed, covers pulled over her. She looked almost to be like sleeping.
On the left side of her bed, next to the wall, there were pillows propped up that looked like someone was just sitting on the bed next to her.
Investigators also see 2 gunshot wounds to her head.
Sid was shot in the left temple and also in the right temple.
Then, looking around the room, detectives find a single shell casing on the floor.
Somebody had taken the other shell casing, trying to hide what they did.
Detectives quickly rule out robbery as a motive.
The place wasn't ransacked. It didn't appear that money or credit cards or anything else was missing.
The one thing detectives couldn't find was the victim's phone. They suspected the killer didn't want the police to know who she'd been communicating with before she was killed.
That would reinforce what investigators suspect. Sid knew her killer.
Sid's door was not forced, and all the windows were locked. So whoever did it was allowed in there.
It had to be somebody she open the door for her and let them in.
In fact, the killer may well have been someone close to her.
In homicide cases, 2/3 of the cases that the victims are transgender. The people who end up killing are, intimate partners.
Unfortunately, the apartment complex didn't have any security cameras. So there was no video that could have identified the killer.
After finishing up at the apartment, detectives returned to their office to talk to Sid's mother.
The first thing I want to ask about is, when did Sid transition?
It was right out of high school.
Sid's mother admits that at first it was hard for her to deal with the change.
I was mad, but we got around it. I accepted it. Took a little, not long, but it took a little minute for me to come around.
Eventually, Sid's whole family embraced her new identity.
Your personality doesn't change. It doesn't change who you are, the soul that you have.
Was there anybody that had a problem with Sid being trans?
No, she got along with everybody.
If you had a problem with her, that was your problem, not her problem.
But Sid's mother admits she doesn't know much about her daughter's personal life.
She was private for the most part. She really didn't talk much about her relationships.
However, Jackie says that a few days ago, her daughter had called and shared something very important about her life.
She was like, "Yeah, I got something to tell you. I don't want you to be upset."
She told me that she had HIV.
Detectives in Albany, New York, investigating the murder of a Sid Hemingway Powell, have just learned that not long before her death, the 30-year-old trans woman had tested positive for HIV.
She called me. She was like, "Mommy, they said I had HIV."
She was like, "I messed up." And I'm like, I immediately start crying.
Sid's mother tried to remain positive.
I was like, "Babe, you're gonna be all right."
This is 2022. The advancements in medication and technology, it's been tremendous. You can live a long, healthy, normal life with this situation as long as you take care of yourself.
While HIV is no longer a death sentence, detectives do wonder if it had something to do with Sid's murder.
The biggest takeaway from Sid's apartment was that whoever killed her was allowed into that apartment and was someone that she allowed to get in her bed with her.
It was possible that her killer was a lover who had just found out about the test results, who also tested positive, and maybe blamed Sid.
But Jackie doesn't know who that could have been.
My kids don't really tell me about their private life because I start asking questions. I got 100 questions.
After talking to Sid's mother, detectives interview other members of her family, hoping Sid may have confided in them.
She just wanted the same thing that every girl wants.
She wants somebody who's gonna love her openly.
But for Sid, that was sometimes hard to find.
Sid's sister told detectives that Sid would sometimes date men who were on the down low, men who presented as straight to the world.
A man like that could certainly fit the profile of the killer being constructed by detectives.
If you're on the down low, if you're ashamed and embarrassed to be with this person, imagine how you'd react if they tell you they have HIV and you're at risk.
Now detectives are looking for a man in Sid's recent past. But can her family give them a name?
Rumors started flooding in and everybody started saying different names.
But there's one name in particular that keeps coming up.
Very early on, Ayer's name was being provided to us by different family and friends.
26-year-old Ayer Robinson had known Sid for quite some time.
Albany is a small city, and the Robinsons and Hemingways had a cousin or two in common, and they kinda came up near each other.
Sid and Ayer would often hang out and smoke weed, but eventually they took things to the next level.
Sid and Ayer Robinson had been together in a non-exclusive relationship for a long time.
I know about their relationship for, I think, 5 years. It may have been even longer than that.
However, those close to Ayer didn't know.
Nobody from his life at that time knew.
He has children and baby moms and things like that, whatever. It was obviously a lot more difficult for him.
Given the complicated nature of their relationship, police suspect Ayer may have been involved in Sid's murder.
Right then and there, he's a person of interest. He's somebody we're definitely going to want to speak to at some point.
But when detectives ask if they suspect Ayer had something to do with Sid's death, the family finds it hard to believe.
Sid definitely loved Ayer. She mentioned it many, many times.
Every time she talks about it, she's like, oh, but he loves me. We just, we can't be together.
And according to Sid's brother, Ayer knew about Sid's recent HIV diagnosis.
Sid told her brother that she had shared the news with him soon after she got her test results.
And though Ayer is at the top of the list of people police need to talk to, he isn't the only name on it.
According to Sid's siblings, she had been seeing another guy, someone they knew less about than Ayer.
But we actually never met the guy.
They knew him only as Big Papa.
Sid's friends and family were all aware of Big Papa, but the only person who had seen him was Sid's brother Amir, and that occurred on a FaceTime.
Can you describe him for me?
He was a white guy, older guy.
And he had money to burn.
She would ask him for stuff or whatever, and he would give it to her. That was kind of the relationship with him.
Big Papa got referred to as a sugar daddy.
He would take her to clubs and parties, and he would let her use his car when she needed to go somewhere.
But she never told you his name?
No, never.
Hoping to track down both Ayer and Big Papa, investigators subpoena Sid's phone records.
They also subpoenaed her credit card, social media, and bank accounts. Anything that might help track her movements in her final days.
While waiting for results from the subpoenas, detectives received the results of the autopsy.
The autopsy confirmed that there were 2 shots fired into her head, both at close range.
There was some stippling around the wound, and there was damage to the skin, consistent with a gun being pressed against the head and fired.
The time of death was late Friday night or early Saturday morning, sometime before 6 a.m.
But who was with Sid late that night? A call from Sid's mom provides a possible answer.
Homicide?
There is something that she hadn't mentioned that might be important.
She stated she had been with Sid a couple days prior. Sid had been FaceTiming a male in Louisiana.
His name was DJ Barnes.
They had met online. They were messaging over Facebook.
But it was more than just an online relationship.
Sid had actually bought him a bus ticket to come up here from Louisiana. DJ was going to be coming into town before the date of Sid's death.
Was he some kind of online predator?
Detectives have just learned that before she was murdered, a Sid Hemingway Powell was planning a first-time meetup with a man she met online.
Sid had been communicating online with a man named DJ Barnes, back and forth, and it was very flirtatious.
DJ and Sid had met through social media, and there was a plan for him to come to Albany to visit her.
Had DJ traveled to Albany to see Sid and then killed her?
That was another question that needed to be answered.
Maybe the meeting didn't go how DJ hoped it would. Since they never met in person, maybe he didn't know Sid was a trans woman.
When detectives get access to Sid's phone records, The first contact information they pull is for DJ Barnes.
Detective Laura conducted a phone interview with him, and he admitted to having some sort of like online relationship with her.
But he insists he had nothing to do with her death.
He said he learned about what happened through social media and that he was sad he never actually got to meet Sid in person.
He planned on trying to come up and see her, but he said it never ended up happening.
So detectives ask him about the bus ticket to Albany that Sid had bought him.
He said his boss never ended up giving him the time off, so he never used the bus ticket.
Investigators contact the bus company to confirm DJ's story.
The bus ticket was never cashed in.
Albany police were able to show that he didn't leave Louisiana.
With DJ eliminated as a suspect, detectives turn their attention to Sid's alleged sugar daddy, the man known as Big Papa.
I never met him. I never seen him in person.
But now, detectives are able to identify him.
We figured out through her phone records Big Papa's real name.
He's a 60-year-old Albany resident named Kyle Collins.
The investigators ran his name through a police database, and they found a very minimal criminal record. The worst thing was a fairly recent charge of petty larceny.
But when detectives head to the address on his arrest record, there's nothing there.
It was just an empty lot. If he lived there before, he doesn't now.
When investigators call him, though, they have more luck.
Hello? We were able to finally get in contact with him by phone, but he kept the interview very short.
What exactly was your connection with her?
According to Kyle, they talked on the phone fairly regularly, but it had been nearly a year since he'd seen her in person.
Kyle had not seen her in a while, and his reason was that Sid was too expensive for him.
What do you mean?
Kyle says that Sid liked to party and go to clubs, and that she'd ask him for money.
All right, look, I'm gonna ask you straight up. Did you have anything to do with her murder?
Absolutely not.
He even claims he was out of town the night Sid died, and his phone's GPS data can confirm it.
A follow-on of his phone records, he showed not to be in the area of Sid's apartment on the night she was murdered.
There was no indication that Big Papa did any harm to Sid.
But after clearing Kyle Collins, investigators get another possible lead.
Detectives were contacted by another one of Sid's friends who said she was hanging out with Sid at her apartment on the Thursday before the murder.
While she was there, Ayer Robinson came over.
What happened then?
She had asked him to go into the bedroom just to talk.
And when they came back, she could tell something was wrong.
The energy was off. She wasn't really there.
What about Ayer?
He didn't really say a word.
I'm just gonna go.
All right. Will call me later?
Yeah. Oh.
When her friend finally asked what was wrong, Sid said she'd received some bad medical news.
What is going on?
I went to the doctor and they told me I have cancer.
Oh my God, Sid. I am so sorry.
Detectives know that Sid didn't have cancer, but she had recently learned that she was HIV positive.
Could that be what Sid told Ayer in the bedroom?
I don't know. Maybe.
To find out more about Sid's diagnosis, detectives contact her doctor.
After getting several HIPAA waivers and consents, we were able to interview medical staff at the Infectious Disease Center.
A staff member says she remembers speaking to Sid when she came in for testing, and that she wasn't alone.
She came in with a guy.
She was accompanied by a black male who also requested HIV testing.
Do you remember who it was?
I can't tell you his name.
Was the man Ayer Robinson?
Ayer Robinson was seeing Sid on the low.
Could an HIV diagnosis be the motive behind the murder?
Detectives investigating the murder of a Sid Hemingway Powell have learned that when she went to a local clinic for an HIV test, she was accompanied by a black male.
The man had also been tested for HIV, but because of patient confidentiality, the clinic staff could not release his name.
Give you his name.
Was Ayer Robinson the man with Sid at the clinic? Or was it another boyfriend investigators have yet to identify?
We'll be getting a court order to unlock the man's records.
Okay.
When detectives get their warrant, their suspicions are confirmed.
Ayer Robinson was the man who came with Sid to get HIV tested on the morning of the murder.
Was he still with her that night when she was murdered?
We had determined that Ayer Robinson was a suspect, but we wanted to keep building. We knew this was going to be a circumstantial case.
Detectives start by getting Ayer's phone records to track his movements after they left the clinic.
We're able to get where their phones were located at certain times. We're able to see they went to a nearby McDonald's, which is in walking distance to the clinic they had gone to.
They enter the restaurant and stay there for a bit, presumably having a meal together.
After that, Sid went to her apartment, and Ayer left in another direction.
We then track him all throughout the city until he goes into a corner store.
Detectives are able to track Ayer's movements until finally he returned to Sid's apartment.
Ayer came back to Sid's apartment around 8 o'clock that night. That was only minutes before Sid made her last social media post.
The data shows Ayer stayed in Sid's apartment until early the next morning, when both phones left the building.
The GPS data showed the phones traveling down the road toward the Albany airport and then stopping at a hotel.
Detectives immediately request footage for any of the hotel's exterior surveillance cameras.
The hotel was affixed with security cameras, which we were able to review. As soon as we did that, that's when it got good.
The video shows a car pull up, and a black male gets out.
He just starts smashing this phone on the ground to the point where he actually has to take his crossbody bag off because it's bouncing so hard.
He then goes over to the dumpster and throws out the cell phone and his sweatshirt.
Investigators can't be sure that Ayer is the man in the video.
You couldn't determine who the person was, but you could tell it was a black male.
However, the investigation of the hotel ultimately yields important evidence.
Through our review of video surveillance, we're able to get a license plate to obtain a registered owner of that vehicle.
The owner is a known friend of Ayer Robinson.
Now, they didn't just have a guy who matched Ayer's description. They had a guy who looked like Ayer driving one of his friend's cars with Ayer's phone in it.
All of that circumstantial evidence is enough to obtain a warrant for Ayer's arrest.
We were conducting surveillance on Ayer Robinson's house, and if he came out, we were going to detain him.
While they're watching the house, Ayer comes outside, but he quickly spots the detectives.
He ended up fleeing on foot.
Please stop! Ayer Robinson proceeds to go in a full sprint down the street.
There's a short foot chase where he discards drugs.
He's dropping something!
The chase comes to an abrupt end.
Some good Samaritan opens his car door into Ayer to stop him. Ayer Robinson is taken into custody.
After the arrest, officers searched the house where Ayer was staying.
A quantity of narcotics, along with a loaded firearm, were recovered.
But the gun is a different caliber from the shell casing recovered beside Sid's bed.
We never recovered the murder weapon. We believe it went in the dumpster along with his hoodie and Sid's phone.
But the police find one more piece of evidence, one that could make their case.
The individual that's destroying the phone in the video surveillance is equipped with a crossbody bag.
Inside Ayer's room, they found a crossbody bag.
We believed it was the same one.
Inside, they see what appears to be dried blood.
That's our evidence.
In a search of Ayer Robinson's house, detectives have found what appears to be dried blood inside a crossbody bag, seemingly identical to the one seen in security video on the man they believe killed a Sid Hemingway Powell.
Detectives believed that blood spatter got on the gun when the 2 fatal shots were fired.
Based on the wounds Sid had, we believed that it was a close contact gunshot. The belief was that after they shot Sid, they would have reholstered their handgun into the crossbody bag.
With Ayer in custody, the detectives are ready to confront him with what they found.
Ayer Robinson's transported down to our detective office and interviewed by Detective O'Donovan and myself.
The detectives tell Ayer that they know he's been having sex with Sid.
People told me they heard you saying you love this person. Right.
Ayer ultimately admitted he was in a relationship with Sid.
I laid with her, I chilled with Sid, you feel what I'm saying?
But he denied testing positive for HIV the morning of the murder.
No, I didn't get no bad with that.
But the detectives know both he and Sid tested positive when they went to the clinic.
It's not even supposed to be that's supposed to be confidential.
Ayer also denies having anything to do with her death.
That's crazy. Yeah, well, that's what we're here to clear up.
So the detectives switch gears to the night of the murder.
So we know that you go over to Sid's house on Thursday the 26th. And you're the last person that's with her while she's alive. I don't think I was the last, though. Okay. At any point, do you take Sid's phone? No.
Ayer just thought we didn't know as much as we knew.
The detectives show Ayer proof that his phone and Sid's were in the same locations after the murder.
We showed him his phone records for the night of incident.
And they tell him they have him on video smashing her phone.
And you're on video getting out of that car, throwing a phone on the ground. Do you remember any of that? Yeah, angry because she went to my phone.
Ayer also has an explanation for why he's on video throwing his hoodie in the dumpster.
I had liquor all over my hoodie. Okay.
He was quick on his feet with answers to stuff.
He even has an explanation for the blood found in the crossbody bag during the search of his home.
He came up with a wild story of how Sid had gotten her finger pricked at the doctor's and she had used a tissue to stop the bleeding and gave it to him.
But there's one question he doesn't have a ready answer to.
We asked Ayer if, when he left the apartment, Sid was bleeding at any point. After about 2 minutes of silence from Ayer, he stated no.
Ayer insists he can't help them.
Bro, I didn't do that to Sid, bro.
Still, after their interview, Ayer Robinson is booked on a second-degree murder charge.
New York's first-degree murder statute is not for what we would consider the more common homicides that occur. It is for somebody who kills a police officer or somebody who almost like plans like an assassination.
When Sid's family hears the news, they are thankful that it seems he is going to pay for what he did.
When I found out that Ayer was arrested, I was happy. So many murders go unsolved, especially for transgender individuals, a lot of times that we don't see the resources put behind those investigations to help actually solve those murders.
In October of 2023, Ayer Robinson goes on trial for murder in the Albany City Court.
Ayer just seemed very nonchalant, like a smug, I'm going to get away with it type of attitude.
And in her opening, the prosecutor admits she doesn't know why Ayer killed Sid.
I think Sid being a trans woman was a large factor, and Ayer maybe not being comfortable yet with admitting that he loved a trans woman. Thankfully, I don't have to prove a motive in New York. I only have to prove the elements of the crime.
Because according to Sid's family, she hadn't given Ayer HIV. It was the other way around.
Sid's literal words to me were, I need to know his results because once I know his results, I'll know where I got it from.
So according to the prosecution, receiving his positive diagnosis the morning of the murder was likely the catalyst for his actions.
Ayer gets his rapid test. So later in the day, there's a phone call to him from the health provider that says, hey, you're positive. That's the night he kills Sid.
When he went to see her that night, he had a gun in his crossbody bag.
Ayer knew what he was going to do when he went over there.
Are you sure you're okay?
Yeah. I mean, it is what it is.
Okay.
He waited till Sid fell asleep.
Then he took out his gun.
The wicked truth of the matter is he shot my baby in the head. He thought she was alive and went and shot her on the other side of the head.
He gets up, picks up one of the shell casings, and he leaves.
The prosecution also shows the jury the security video of Ayer getting rid of the evidence.
He smashed Sid's phone and threw the phone, the gun, and his blood-stained hoodie into a dumpster.
Instead of disputing the evidence, the defense focuses on Sid and her lifestyle.
The defense attorney really victim shamed her in this case. He painted Sid as this promiscuous girl, as a prostitute.
They try to paint Sid in a trial as some type of sexual deviant. That's just crazy.
It's one thing to defend your client. It's another to go after the dead and shame her the way they did.
But the jury finds the evidence more persuasive than the attacks on Sid's character.
Ayer Robinson was found guilty of murder.
When the verdict came in, I was very relieved. For my first time in my life having faith in the American justice system.
And the judge imposes the harshest sentence possible.
Murder in the second degree, the maximum punishment allowable in New York State is 25 years to life.
It's a welcome relief to Sid's family.
I was just glad that we have answers, that we have a resolution to all of this, because so many families don't.
And Sid's family can take solace in the knowledge that she always lived her life with love and compassion, and without apology.
She didn't want to be seen as just a transgender woman. She wanted her transition to be second to her success and who she was as a person.
Don't worry about how people feel about you. Be you and be the best version of you.
She has so many dreams. Rapper, doctor. I used to be like, babe, what you gonna do? I'm gonna do it all, Mom. I'm gonna do it all.
The last night of 1999 began the way millions of others did across America. Fireworks were waiting to be lit. Families were counting down to a new century. And the promise of a fresh beginning filled neighborhoods from coast to coast. In the small border city of Del Rio, Texas, Nothing suggested that before the first sunrise of the year 2000, one family would experience a tragedy that would forever change their lives and unexpectedly expose one of the most elusive serial killers in American history. Del Rio was the kind of community where ordinary routines shaped everyday life. Nestled near the Rio Grande, the city was far removed from the image of sprawling metropolitan crime. Residents knew their neighbors' children played outside, and New Year's Eve was expected to end with celebration rather than violence. Yet, hidden somewhere in the darkness that night was a man who had spent years moving silently across the United States, leaving behind victims in different states, different towns, and different circumstances. He had no permanent address, no stable occupation, and no predictable pattern. By the time investigators would finally learn his name, they would discover that he had spent decades drifting through America almost like a ghost. His name was Tommy Lynn Sells. Later, newspapers would call him the Coast-to-Coast Killer. The nickname reflected not simply the geographical reach of his travels, but also the extraordinary challenge he presented to investigators. Unlike many serial offenders whose crimes remain concentrated within a single city or region, Sells rarely stayed anywhere for long. He rode freight trains, accepted rides from strangers, worked temporary jobs, changed locations constantly, and disappeared before anyone realized he had even been there. For years, murders that occurred hundreds or even thousands of miles apart appeared to be isolated tragedies investigated by separate police departments. No one could see the larger picture because there seemed to be no picture at all. But on that cold night in Texas, his years of anonymity were about to come to an end, not because of advanced forensic science or an undercover investigation, but because one child refused to die. Inside the Harris residence, two young girls were asleep in the same bedroom. 13-year-old Katie Harris had spent the evening like countless other children, preparing to welcome the arrival of the new year. Beside her slept 10-year-old Crystal Searles. There was no reason for either girl to believe the night would be different from any other. Sometime after midnight, Tommy Lynn Sells entered the house through a window. There was no loud confrontation, no forced announcement of his presence. According to the facts later established during the investigation, he made his way into the room where the girls slept. At first, neither child was aware that someone else was inside the room. Then Katie woke up. The moment she realized an intruder was sitting on the bed, she cried out. Her reaction lasted only an instant. Sells attacked immediately. Armed with a knife, he cut Katie's throat. Before Crystal could fully understand what was happening, he turned toward her and attacked as well. Her injuries were catastrophic. Her throat was cut so deeply that survival would seem almost impossible. Believing both girls were dead, Sells left the house as quietly as he had entered. To him, the crime was finished. Another victim, another town, another disappearance before dawn. It fit the pattern that had protected him for years. But this time, something happened that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. Crystal Searles was still alive, gravely wounded and losing an enormous amount of blood. The 10-year-old managed to leave the house and seek help. Every step she took demanded more strength than most people could imagine. She walked hundreds of meters to a neighboring house, where she collapsed after reaching safety. Emergency responders rushed to the scene. Doctors worked to save her life. Meanwhile, investigators entered the Harris home and discovered the horrifying crime scene left behind. Katie Harris had not survived the attack. The investigation initially appeared to resemble countless other homicide cases in which little evidence pointed clearly toward a suspect. The attacker had vanished into the night. There was no obvious connection between him and the victims. But unlike so many murder investigations, detectives possessed something extraordinarily valuable: a living eyewitness. Despite suffering life-threatening injuries, Crystal survived. More importantly, she remembered the face of the man who had attacked her and Katie. Her description allowed investigators to create a composite sketch. It was not merely another drawing to distribute among law enforcement agencies. It became the first real lead toward identifying a man who had spent years avoiding detection, through constant movement and complete unpredictability. Within days, investigators identified Tommy Lynn Sells as the suspect. On January 2nd, 2000, only a short time after the attack, he was arrested. What initially appeared to be the swift resolution of a single murder case soon evolved into something far larger. As detectives questioned Sells, fragments of a much darker history began to emerge. During interviews following his arrest, he confessed to numerous killings. At first, he claimed responsibility for around 22 murders. Later, the number increased dramatically. Eventually, he claimed to have killed more than 70 people. Investigators approached these statements cautiously. Some confessions contained details that appeared to match known evidence. Others conflicted with established facts. Separating truth from exaggeration would become one of the greatest challenges facing law enforcement after his arrest. Yet one conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore. Tommy Lynn Sells had almost certainly committed far more crimes than the murder that had brought him into custody. As authorities from multiple states began comparing unsolved homicide files, they discovered disturbing similarities. Sells had lived a transient existence for decades. He had traveled through California, Texas, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, Idaho, Utah, Mississippi, Florida, and numerous other states. He rarely remained in one place long enough for anyone to remember him. Sometimes he worked temporary labor jobs. Sometimes he cut hair. Sometimes he simply disappeared aboard freight trains or accepted rides from strangers. His victims varied dramatically. Children, women, men, elderly individuals, entire families. The murder weapons changed from case to case. Knives, guns, blunt objects, ropes, even hammers. Crime scenes looked different. Victims appeared unrelated. Nothing fit the traditional expectations investigators often rely upon when hunting serial offenders. Instead of a recognizable signature, Sells left confusion. Instead of a geographical center, he left a trail stretching across the United States. Instead of one victim profile, he attacked almost anyone who happened to cross his path. That unpredictability made him extraordinarily difficult to identify while he remained free. Years later, criminal investigators would describe Tommy Lynn Sells as one of the hardest serial killers in modern American history to trace because almost every characteristic normally used to connect multiple murders was absent. His crimes crossed jurisdictions. His methods evolved. His victims shared almost nothing in common. And for much of his adult life, he himself barely seemed to exist within any permanent community. Yet despite all of those obstacles, his years of freedom ultimately ended because of one extraordinary survivor. Had Crystal Searles died that night alongside Katie Harris, it is impossible to know how much longer Tommy Lynn Sells might have continued moving unnoticed across America. Her survival transformed a single homicide investigation into the exposure of a man whose name would soon become associated with one of the most disturbing collections of confessions in American criminal history. This story, however, does not begin with New Year's Eve in Texas. To understand how investigators eventually found Tommy Lynn Sells, it is necessary to travel back decades earlier to a childhood marked by instability, violence, addiction, and neglect, a beginning that would shape the course of a life ending not in anonymity, but on death row, after leaving behind questions that remain unresolved even today. Before Tommy Lynn Sells became known to investigators across the United States, before newspapers labeled him the coast-to-coast killer, and before detectives began comparing unsolved murder files from multiple states, he was simply a child born into circumstances that were marked by instability from the very beginning. Understanding those early years is not an attempt to excuse the crimes he would later commit. Thousands of children endure neglect, abuse, and hardship without ever harming another person. Rather, his childhood provides the factual background that investigators and mental health professionals later examined, while trying to understand how one man could spend decades drifting across America, leaving behind a trail of violence that remains impossible to measure with certainty. Tommy Lynn Sells was born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California. He entered the world with a twin sister named Tammy. The siblings shared the same beginning, but their lives quickly diverged in the most tragic way imaginable. When the twins were approximately 18 months old, Tammy died from meningitis. Tommy contracted the illness as well, but he survived. Although he was too young to consciously remember the event, the loss became one of the earliest tragedies associated with his family. The household itself was far from stable. According to the available information, Tommy's mother struggled to provide consistent care and repeatedly abandoned her children. At different points during his childhood, Tommy lived with relatives before being returned to his mother's care. Rather than experiencing the predictable routines that help children develop a sense of safety and trust, he grew up surrounded by uncertainty. The adults responsible for raising him frequently changed, and the environment around him remained unstable. As he grew older, the problems intensified. By around the age of 7, Tommy had already begun drinking alcohol regularly. Such behavior at an age when most children are only beginning elementary school illustrated how little supervision existed in his daily life. Alcohol was only the beginning. Around the age of 8, according to Sells' own later statements, he became the victim of prolonged sexual abuse committed by an older man. He also claimed that his mother was aware of the abuse but failed to intervene. These allegations became part of his later interviews with investigators and mental health professionals. While those experiences cannot explain or justify the crimes he eventually committed, they became recurring topics whenever experts attempted to understand the severe psychological disturbances that appeared throughout his adult life. By the time he reached approximately 10 years old, Tommy had begun using drugs. Alcohol and narcotics entered his life long before adolescence. During years when emotional development normally depends upon stability, guidance, and protection. Instead, substance abuse became another constant. The progression from alcohol to drugs reflected a childhood almost entirely lacking healthy boundaries. It also foreshadowed the addictions that would continue into adulthood. Around the ages of 13 or 14, Tommy left home altogether. Rather than returning after a brief argument or temporary rebellion, he began living as a runaway. His new life consisted of freight trains, hitchhiking, temporary jobs, and constant movement from one place to another. America became both his home and his hiding place. Without a permanent residence, stable employment, or lasting relationships, he drifted from state to state, surviving however he could. During these years, he occasionally found work performing temporary labor or cutting hair. But none of these jobs provided lasting stability. Instead, they merely supported a transient existence that allowed him to disappear almost as quickly as he arrived. For law enforcement agencies years later, this lifestyle would become one of the defining characteristics of his criminal career. Most serial offenders establish routines within a relatively limited geographical area. Investigators can often analyze locations, victim selection, or travel patterns to narrow their search. Tommy Lynn Sells presented an entirely different challenge. His life lacked permanence long before his crimes became known. He was accustomed to boarding freight trains without destinations, accepting rides from strangers, moving between states, and living under constantly changing circumstances. As investigators later reconstructed his movements, they found themselves confronting a man whose own history was fragmented across much of the country. The instability of his early years also influenced how mental health professionals later evaluated him. Following his arrest, specialists described significant personality disturbances alongside long-term substance abuse and an apparent absence of empathy. During interviews conducted years later, Sells himself would repeatedly refer back to his childhood. He claimed that memories of abuse resurfaced while committing violent acts. Those statements became part of psychological assessments, but investigators remained careful not to interpret them as explanations for his crimes. Many offenders attempt to frame their personal histories in ways that shift attention away from individual responsibility. The documented abuse and neglect in Tommy's childhood were real concerns. Yet they could never diminish the deliberate choices that resulted in the suffering of his victims. As adolescence gave way to adulthood, Tommy continued living on the margins of society. There was no permanent career, no family life that provided lasting structure, and no fixed location where neighbors could know him for years. Instead, his identity became that of a drifter. He traveled through numerous states including California, Texas, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, Idaho, Utah, Mississippi, Florida, and others. Sometimes he stayed briefly before moving on. Sometimes he disappeared entirely, leaving behind few records of where he had gone next. This constant movement would eventually frustrate homicide investigators across multiple jurisdictions because every community viewed him as a temporary visitor rather than a long-term resident. Years later, after his arrest, detectives would begin comparing unsolved cases from different parts of the country. What they discovered was not a clear pattern, but an unsettling absence of one. Unlike many serial killers whose crimes reveal consistent victim selection, Tommy Lynn's cells appeared capable of targeting almost anyone. Children, women, men, elderly victims. And even entire families appeared among the cases connected to him. The weapons also varied. Investigators linked him to crimes involving knives, firearms, blunt objects, ropes, and hammers. Crime scenes differed dramatically from one another. Some attacks occurred inside homes after nighttime break-ins. Others involved entirely different circumstances. This lack of consistency became one of the defining mysteries surrounding his criminal history. Looking back, investigators recognized that the transient lifestyle established during his teenage years had become one of the greatest assets in avoiding capture. Every move to another state effectively placed new distance between himself and previous investigations. Police departments focused on solving crimes within their own jurisdictions. During the 1980s and much of the 1990s, the exchange of forensic information between distant agencies remained far more limited than it would become in later years. DNA technology also had significant limitations compared to modern standards. As a result, murders that may have shared a common offender frequently remained isolated within separate investigative files. Tommy Lynn's cells moved through those gaps almost unnoticed. Even when he encountered law enforcement, it did not immediately reveal the broader picture. His transient lifestyle, combined with the absence of a consistent victim profile, allowed him to blend into the background of a country where millions of people cross state lines every year. To those who briefly met him, he could appear simply as another traveler looking for work or another hitchhiker passing through town. Few could have imagined that investigators would later examine whether he had been connected to killings stretching across much of the United States. One event during this period demonstrated that his life could have taken a dramatically different course. In 1992, years before the murder of Katie Harris, Tommy attacked a young woman named Fabian Witherspoon after she offered him food. Unlike many of his later victims, she fought back with extraordinary determination, seriously injuring him and surviving the assault. His arrest led to a prison sentence of approximately 5 years. During that period, he underwent mental health evaluations that documented severe personality problems alongside substance abuse. For a brief moment, it appeared that imprisonment might interrupt the violent trajectory of his life. Instead, following his release, he returned once again to the transient existence he had known since adolescence. The freight trains, temporary jobs, endless highways, and constant movement resumed. Whatever opportunity existed for intervention had passed. In hindsight, investigators would later view these years as the foundation upon which the remainder of Tommy Lindsell's criminal history was built. The neglected child had become a wandering adult, moving anonymously through countless communities while leaving behind questions that would remain unresolved long after his eventual execution. Yet the most disturbing period of his life still lay ahead. For nearly 2 decades, as America changed around him and the century drew toward its close, Tommy Lindsell's continued traveling from state to state. Somewhere along those roads, investigators believe the list of victims continued to grow, even if the exact number may never be known with certainty. By the time Tommy Lindsell's reached adulthood, instability was no longer simply a condition of his childhood. It had become his entire way of life. He did not settle in one city, build a lasting career, or establish the kinds of relationships that anchor most people to a community. Instead, he embraced a transient existence that carried him from one end of the United States to the other. Investigators would later describe this constant movement as one of the greatest reasons he remained unidentified for so many years. Long before his name appeared in headlines, Tommy Lindsell's had already learned how to disappear. His home was wherever he happened to be that day. Sometimes it was a freight train rolling across the American landscape. Sometimes it was the passenger seat of a stranger's vehicle after accepting a ride along the highway. Other times it was a temporary room earned through seasonal work or a short-term labor job that lasted only days or weeks before he moved on again. There was no predictable routine, no permanent mailing address, no stable employer who could account for his whereabouts over months or years. This lifestyle gave him something many offenders never possess: anonymity. To one town, he was simply a traveler looking for work. To another, he was someone passing through without attracting attention. Then, almost as quickly as he appeared, he would leave again. By the time investigators later attempted to reconstruct his movements, much of that history had already faded into scattered memories and incomplete records. According to the information compiled after his arrest, Sells traveled through numerous states during these years, including California, Texas, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, Idaho, Utah, Mississippi, Florida, and many others. His routes were rarely consistent. He did not follow one predictable circuit across the country. Instead, his movements reflected the unpredictability of someone who rarely planned far into the future. Freight trains offered one means of transportation. Hitchhiking offered another. Temporary work provided enough income to continue moving. Every new destination represented another place where no one knew his past. That absence of history became one of his greatest advantages. Modern criminal investigations often rely upon patterns. Detectives search for similarities that connect crimes occurring in different places or at different times. They compare victim profiles, methods of attack, geographic locations, forensic evidence, and behavioral characteristics. Serial offenders frequently reveal habits they cannot easily conceal. Some repeatedly target victims of a similar age or appearance. Others commit crimes within familiar neighborhoods or use the same weapon repeatedly. Behavioral analysts study these consistencies because patterns often reveal the offender long before investigators know his identity. Tommy Lindsell's challenged almost every one of those assumptions. One of the most striking characteristics of the cases associated with him was the complete absence of a consistent victim profile. Investigators found no evidence that he restricted his attacks to one particular group. Among the victims connected to him or considered during investigations were children, adult women, adult men, elderly individuals, and entire families. Such diversity made comparisons between cases extraordinarily difficult. If one murder involved a child and another involved an adult male hundreds of miles away, detectives rarely had reason to suspect they were searching for the same offender. Geographic separation further complicated those investigations. A homicide detective in Texas naturally concentrated on crimes committed within Texas. Investigators in Illinois focused on Illinois. Detectives in Missouri examined Missouri cases. Without compelling forensic links or obvious similarities, few departments had practical reasons to compare every unsolved murder with agencies located hundreds or thousands of miles away. During much of the period in which cells traveled across the country, nationwide coordination between separate jurisdictions remained more limited than it would later become. DNA technology was also far less advanced than it is today, reducing opportunities to identify connections through forensic science. Even the methods of killing appeared inconsistent. Investigators eventually linked Tommy Lynn's cells to cases involving knives, guns, bats, ropes, and hammers. In many serial murder investigations, the weapon itself becomes part of the offender's signature. Cells offered no such consistency. One crime might involve a knife, while another relied upon an entirely different weapon. The locations varied just as dramatically. Some attacks occurred after nighttime break-ins into private homes. Others involved different circumstances altogether. Instead of developing recognizable habits, cells appeared to adapt continuously, leaving investigators with very little behavioral consistency to examine. This unpredictability eventually became one of the defining features of his criminal profile. Rather than following a carefully planned ritual, he seemed capable of acting whenever opportunity presented itself. According to the information later gathered by investigators, he did not limit himself to one category of victim or one style of offense. That flexibility made his crimes unusually difficult to connect. Looking back after his arrest, detectives recognized that they had been investigating isolated fragments of a much larger picture without realizing those fragments belonged together. At the center of that picture stood a man who almost never remained in one place long enough for suspicion to follow him. His constant movement across America effectively separated each investigation from the next. A murder committed in one state did not automatically prompt detectives to examine a transient worker who had already traveled hundreds of miles away. By the time local authorities began searching for possible suspects, Tommy Lynn's cells might already have disappeared into another region entirely. His lifestyle created distance not only in geography, but also in time, allowing investigations to lose momentum while he continued moving forward. As authorities later reconstructed his history, another disturbing issue emerged: the uncertainty surrounding the actual number of victims. Following his arrest, Sells made numerous confessions. Initially, he admitted involvement in approximately 22 murders. Later, the number increased dramatically. Eventually, he claimed responsibility for more than 70 killings. Such extraordinary statements immediately raised difficult questions for investigators. Were these confessions genuine? Were some exaggerated? Could they all be verified? Detectives approached each claim cautiously. Some confessions appeared credible because Sells provided details that investigators believed only the offender could have known. Other statements conflicted with established evidence, creating doubts about their reliability. As a result, law enforcement never accepted every confession at face value. Instead, each case required careful comparison with existing evidence, witness statements, and forensic findings. This painstaking process produced mixed results. Certain confessions strengthened existing suspicions, while others remained impossible to confirm. Consequently, even after years of investigation, the true extent of Tommy Lynn Sells' crimes remains uncertain. Authorities generally believe he was connected to at least 22 murders, yet the full number may never be established with certainty. Among the most controversial examples was the murder of the Dardeen family in Illinois in 1987. Years after the crime, Sells confessed to committing the murders. However, investigators encountered significant problems when comparing his account with available physical evidence. Some aspects of his confession failed to align with known facts, preventing authorities from reaching a definitive conclusion. To this day, the question of whether Tommy Lynn Sells truly murdered the Dardeen family remains unresolved. Similar uncertainty surrounded several other investigations conducted across multiple states. In some cases, detectives considered him a viable suspect because of his travel history or because portions of his confessions matched previously unknown details. In others, the evidence simply was not sufficient to support a firm conclusion. This uncertainty has become one of the defining characteristics of the Sells case. Unlike many convicted serial killers whose known victims can be identified with reasonable confidence, Tommy Lynn Sells left behind a criminal record filled with unanswered questions. Investigators continue to distinguish carefully between confirmed crimes, suspected involvement, and unsupported confessions. That distinction is essential because Sells himself contributed to the uncertainty. By repeatedly increasing the number of murders he claimed to have committed, he complicated efforts to separate fact from exaggeration. Whether he sought attention, control, or some other personal motive remains less important than the practical consequence of his statements. Every confession demanded investigation, consuming enormous law enforcement resources while offering no guarantee of truth. Yet despite these uncertainties, one conclusion became increasingly clear. Tommy Lynn Sells had spent approximately 2 decades living in a way that allowed him to move almost invisibly across America. His lack of a permanent home, his willingness to travel constantly, his changing occupations, his unpredictable methods, and his absence of a consistent victim profile combined to create one of the most difficult investigative challenges many detectives would ever encounter. Looking back, it becomes apparent that the greatest obstacle was not merely finding Tommy Lynn Sells. The greater challenge was recognizing that so many apparently unrelated crimes might have been connected to the same individual. For years, no one saw that connection. Each jurisdiction pursued its own investigation. Each family mourned its own loss. Each case appeared isolated. It would take the survival of a single child in Texas before investigators finally began assembling the scattered pieces into one disturbing portrait. Before that moment arrived, however, another encounter had already demonstrated that Tommy Lynn Sells was not invincible. Years before the attack in Del Rio, one young woman made a decision born from compassion, only to find herself fighting for her life. Unlike many others who crossed his path, she survived, and her resistance would provide one of the earliest opportunities to stop him before his most infamous crime. By the early 1990s, Tommy Lynn Sells had already spent years living as a drifter. He moved from one place to another with little permanence, relying on temporary work, freight trains, hitchhiking, and whatever opportunities allowed him to continue traveling. His life left few lasting traces. For investigators who would later examine his history, these years remained difficult to reconstruct because his movements were so unpredictable. He rarely stayed in one community long enough to become familiar to local residents. And when he left, he often disappeared without leaving behind more than scattered memories. During this period, nothing publicly connected him to the long list of murders he would later claim to have committed. To those who briefly encountered him, he could appear to be little more than another traveler struggling to survive. Yet beneath that appearance lay a capacity for sudden and extreme violence. One incident in particular would later stand out because it represented something remarkably rare in Tommy Lynn Sells' criminal history. It was an attack that did not end the way he intended. Instead of becoming another unidentified victim, the woman he targeted survived, fought back with extraordinary determination, and ultimately helped bring about his arrest years before the crime that would make his name nationally known. The date was May 13, 1992. The young woman was 19-year-old Fabian Witherspoon. Unlike later victims who encountered Tommy Lynn Sells through violent circumstances beyond their control, Fabian's first interaction with him began with an act of kindness. According to the available information, she saw a man standing with a sign asking for food and offering to work in exchange for something to eat. There was nothing outwardly extraordinary about the request. Across America, people experiencing hardship often relied on the generosity of strangers. Fabian made the compassionate decision to help. She offered him food and brought him to her home. It was a simple act motivated by empathy rather than suspicion. There was no indication that she believed she was placing herself in danger. Instead, she responded as many compassionate people might have, choosing to assist someone who appeared to be in need. The decision would quickly become a fight for survival. Once inside the house, Tommy Lynn Sells took advantage of the trust she had shown him. While Fabian was occupied preparing food, he armed himself with a kitchen knife. The atmosphere changed instantly. What had begun as an act of generosity transformed into a violent confrontation. Sells forced Fabian into the bathroom and attempted to sexually assault her. In many attacks committed by violent offenders, victims are overwhelmed by the speed and brutality of the assault. The offender relies upon fear, surprise, and physical control to prevent resistance. But this encounter unfolded differently. Fabian refused to surrender. Faced with an armed attacker inside her own home, she fought back with everything available to her. According to the documented account, she grabbed a ceramic duck and repeatedly struck Sells in the head. The improvised weapon became her first means of resistance. Rather than allowing the assault to continue unchecked, she created an opportunity to challenge her attacker. The struggle escalated. At some point during the confrontation, Fabian managed to gain control of the knife. She turned the weapon against Sells and stabbed him multiple times. The injuries were severe. Reports later indicated that he suffered significant wounds affecting his liver, kidney, and groin area. These were not superficial injuries. They were life-threatening enough to drastically alter the outcome of the attack. Despite his injuries, Tommy Lynn Sells remained dangerous. Before fleeing the scene, he struck Fabian with a piano bench. Even after sustaining multiple stab wounds, he possessed enough strength to retaliate violently. Then he escaped. But unlike so many previous occasions when he had simply disappeared into another town or another state, this time his injuries prevented him from traveling far. He collapsed shortly afterward and was arrested. For investigators examining his life years later, the incident became one of the earliest documented examples demonstrating both his willingness to attack a stranger without warning and the extraordinary courage shown by someone who refused to become another victim. Fabian Witherspoon's actions almost certainly saved her own life. Facing an armed attacker inside the isolation of her own home, she did not know whether help would arrive in time. She could not know whether resistance would succeed. Yet she continued fighting despite the overwhelming danger. Her survival stands as one of the few known occasions in which Tommy Lynn Sells failed to complete the violent attack he had initiated. The legal consequences followed. Sells was convicted for the assault and sentenced to approximately 5 years in prison. For the first time in years, his constant movement across America came to an abrupt halt. The highways, freight trains, and temporary jobs were replaced by incarceration. During this period, mental health evaluations documented serious personality disturbances alongside long-standing substance abuse. These assessments would later become part of the broader effort to understand the psychological characteristics of a man who had spent much of his life drifting between communities while engaging in escalating violence. Even so, investigators and mental health professionals remained careful to distinguish between explanation and excuse. The existence of psychological disorders or traumatic childhood experiences could never diminish responsibility for deliberate acts of violence committed against innocent people. While Sells served his prison sentence, one unavoidable question emerged in retrospect. Could this imprisonment have prevented future crimes? At the time, authorities had no reason to believe they were dealing with a man who might eventually confess to dozens of murders. The conviction reflected the known offense: a violent assault and attempted sexual attack against Fabian Witherspoon. Nothing in the available information suggested the full scope of allegations that would surface. Years later, after his arrest in Texas, when his sentence ended, Tommy Lynn Sells was released. Instead of beginning a stable life, He returned almost immediately to the same transient existence that had defined much of his adulthood. Once again, he traveled across multiple states. Once again, he relied on temporary work and constant movement. Once again, he blended into the background of communities that viewed him only as a passing stranger. From the perspective of later investigators, this period is particularly unsettling because it represents a lost opportunity whose significance could only be recognized after the fact. Authorities had successfully prosecuted him for a serious violent crime, yet the broader pattern that would later emerge remained hidden. Without evidence connecting him to other murders, there was no legal basis to hold him beyond the sentence imposed by the court. He left prison as a convicted violent offender, but not as a known serial killer. The years following his release continued much as before. Tommy Lynn's cells resumed moving across America, rarely staying in one place for long. Investigators would later examine these travels while attempting to compare them with unsolved homicide cases scattered throughout different states. His confessions after the 2000 arrest would eventually direct attention toward numerous investigations. But during the 1990s, those connections had not yet been recognized. Police departments focused on crimes within their own jurisdictions. Communities remained unaware that a transient offender might be passing quietly through their neighborhoods before disappearing again. Looking back, the attack on Fabian Witherspoon reveals several characteristics that would later become associated with Tommy Lynn's cells. The assault was sudden, opportunistic, and committed against someone who had shown him kindness rather than hostility. There was no long-term relationship between attacker and victim. There was no complicated motive rooted in personal conflict. Instead, violence emerged rapidly after he gained access to the victim's home. The case also demonstrated something equally important under certain circumstances. Determined resistance could interrupt even an extremely dangerous offender's plans. Fabian's courage did more than ensure her own survival. Her actions led directly to Cell's arrest and imprisonment, temporarily removing him from the public. Yet history would ultimately show that the interruption was only temporary. After his release, he disappeared once more into the vast geography of the United States. Years later, on another ordinary evening, he would enter another home through a window. Two young girls would be asleep inside. One would lose her life. The other would survive against unimaginable odds. Just as Fabian Witherspoon had once refused to surrender, another victim would fight through catastrophic injuries and provide investigators with the breakthrough they had been seeking for years. That New Year's Eve attack in Del Rio, Texas, would finally expose the man who had spent decades moving almost invisibly from one state to another, bringing an end to one of the most elusive and deeply disturbing criminal journeys in modern American history. For years, Tommy Lynn's cells had lived in constant motion. He crossed state lines with remarkable ease, worked temporary jobs when necessary, rode freight trains, accepted rides from strangers, and disappeared before anyone had reason to remember his face. Investigators would later conclude that this transient lifestyle was one of the primary reasons he avoided detection for so long. His alleged crimes stretched across multiple jurisdictions. His victims shared no obvious characteristics, and his methods varied enough to prevent investigators from recognizing a consistent pattern. The very unpredictability that made him so difficult to trace also allowed him to remain anonymous. Yet after nearly 2 decades of drifting across America, one night in a quiet Texas neighborhood would bring that anonymity to an abrupt end. The final hours of 1999 unfolded like countless New Year's Eve celebrations across the country. Families prepared to welcome a new year and, with it, the beginning of a new century. In Del Rio, Texas, the atmosphere was no different. It was a community where people expected celebration rather than tragedy, where homes represented safety, and where children could go to bed believing that the greatest excitement would come from fireworks and midnight celebrations. Inside the Harris residence, 13-year-old Kayleen Katie Harris and 10-year-old Crystal Searles shared a bedroom. The two girls had settled in for the night, unaware that someone outside had already chosen their home. Nothing in the available information suggests that Tommy Lynn Sells had any prior relationship with either child or their family. As with many of the crimes later associated with him, the attack appeared to be one of opportunity rather than personal connection. Sometime during the night of December 31st, 1999, Sells entered the house through a window. The home, which should have represented security, became vulnerable in the silence of the late hours. Unlike crimes involving forced confrontations at the front door or prolonged interactions with victims, this intrusion relied upon surprise. The family was asleep. There was no warning that an intruder had entered the residence. According to the established facts, Sells made his way into the bedroom where Katie Harris and Crystal Searles were sleeping. At first, the room remained quiet. Then Katie awoke. The exact thoughts that passed through her mind in those final moments can never be known. What is known is that she realized someone was sitting on the bed. Startled and frightened, she cried out. Her reaction lasted only an instant before Sells launched his attack. Armed with a knife, he assaulted Katie, inflicting fatal injuries by cutting her throat. The attack was sudden and overwhelming, leaving virtually no opportunity for escape. It was an act of extraordinary violence carried out against a 13-year-old child who had only moments earlier been asleep in what should have been the safest place she knew. Sells then turned his attention to Crystal Searles. The 10-year-old was attacked with the same brutality. Her throat was cut so deeply that survival appeared impossible. The injuries were catastrophic. By every outward appearance, both girls had succumbed to the assault. Believing there were no surviving witnesses, Tommy Lynn Sells left the house. From his perspective, the crime had been completed. He disappeared into the darkness just as he had so many times before. Another attack. Another community. Another opportunity to move on before investigators could identify him. That assumption proved to be the greatest mistake of his criminal life. Although critically injured, Crystal Searles was still alive. The severity of her wounds cannot be overstated. She had suffered life-threatening injuries that would have prevented most people from moving at all. Yet despite catastrophic blood loss and unimaginable pain, she accomplished something that would ultimately alter the course of one of America's most complex serial murder investigations. She managed to leave the house and seek help. According to the available information, Crystal walked approximately 400 meters to a neighboring home. Every step represented an extraordinary act of determination. She was only 10 years old, gravely wounded, and struggling to survive. Yet she continued moving until she reached people who could summon emergency assistance. Her arrival immediately transformed what might have become a murder investigation without witnesses into something entirely different. Emergency responders rushed to the scene. Medical personnel worked to save Crystal's life while law enforcement officers began examining the Harris residence. Inside the bedroom, investigators found the devastating aftermath of the attack. Katie Harris had died from her injuries. The crime scene reflected a level of violence that shocked even experienced investigators. At that moment, however, detectives possessed only fragments of information. The attacker had escaped. There was no obvious relationship between the victims and the offender. The case initially appeared similar to countless other homicide investigations in which identifying the suspect would depend upon evidence collected after the crime. Then investigators realized that Crystal had survived. More importantly, despite the trauma she had endured, she remembered the face of the man who attacked her. Once her condition allowed, detectives interviewed the young survivor. Her ability to recall and describe the intruder became the turning point in the investigation. Using her description, law enforcement created a composite sketch of the suspect. Composite sketches are often one piece of a much larger investigative process. But in this case, the drawing became an invaluable lead. It provided investigators with a visual representation of a man who, until then, had successfully remained anonymous in community after community. The information supplied by Crystal enabled detectives to move beyond an unknown offender toward identifying a specific individual. The investigation advanced rapidly. Within only a few days of the attack, authorities identified Tommy Lynn Sells as their primary suspect. On January 2, 2000, he was arrested. Considering the complexity that would later emerge regarding his criminal history, the speed of the arrest was remarkable. Yet that success depended almost entirely upon the existence of a survivor who could identify him. Had Crystal Searles died alongside Katie Harris, investigators would almost certainly have faced a dramatically different challenge. There would have been no eyewitness description, no composite sketch based upon direct observation, and potentially no immediate path toward identifying the intruder. Crystal's survival fundamentally changed the trajectory of the case. As detectives questioned Tommy Lynn Sells following his arrest, they initially focused on the Texas murders. However, the investigation soon expanded beyond anything they had anticipated. During interviews, Sells began confessing to numerous other killings committed over many years. What had begun as the investigation of one horrific murder rapidly evolved into an examination of crimes stretching across multiple states. Detectives who had previously viewed unsolved homicides as isolated incidents suddenly found themselves considering whether they might share a common offender. Information from different jurisdictions began flowing toward Texas as investigators compared old case files with Sells' statements. The process proved both promising and frustrating. Some of his confessions appeared to contain details that investigators believed only the actual offender could have known. Other statements failed to match available evidence, creating uncertainty regarding their accuracy. Nevertheless, the arrest in Del Rio had accomplished something unprecedented. For the first time, law enforcement agencies across multiple states had a single suspect whose movements potentially overlapped with numerous unsolved murders. The importance of Crystal Searles' role in that development cannot be overstated. She was not merely the only surviving victim of the Del Rio attack. She became the key witness whose testimony opened the door to a nationwide re-examination of Tommy Lynn Sells' past. Throughout the legal proceedings that followed, Crystal remained one of the most significant witnesses against him. Her courage extended beyond surviving the assault itself. She also participated in the judicial process that ultimately led to his conviction. Meanwhile, the Harris family faced the unimaginable loss of 13-year-old Katie Harris. Every criminal investigation necessarily focuses on identifying the offender. But at its heart, this case remained the story of a young life taken far too soon. Katie had been asleep in her own home when her future was stolen. She never had the opportunity to grow into adulthood, pursue her dreams, or experience the life that awaited beyond childhood. Her family, like so many families affected by violent crime, would carry that loss forever. While Tommy Lynn Sells' name would eventually dominate headlines, the lasting significance of the case rests equally with the victims whose lives were forever changed. One child was murdered. Another survived against overwhelming odds and transformed a seemingly impossible investigation into one of the most significant breakthroughs in modern American criminal history. Yet even after his arrest, one crucial question remained unanswered. Exactly how many lives had Tommy Lynn Sells destroyed before the night he entered the Harris home? As investigators from across the United States began comparing decades of unsolved murders with his confessions, they discovered that determining the truth would prove almost as difficult as finding him had been. Tommy Lynn Sells' arrest on January 2, 2000, marked the end of his freedom, but it also marked the beginning of an investigation unlike almost any other in modern American criminal history. Detectives initially believed they were dealing with the man responsible for the murder of 13-year-old Katie Harris and the attempted murder of 10-year-old Crystal Searles. Those crimes alone demanded an exhaustive investigation and prosecution. Yet as interviews with Sells continued, the scope of the case expanded far beyond a single house in Del Rio, Texas. What followed forced investigators to reconsider years of unsolved homicides scattered across multiple states and raised a question that remains unresolved even today. How many people had Tommy Lynn Sells actually killed? During questioning, Sells began talking about murders committed long before his arrest in Texas. His statements did not remain limited to one confession or one additional crime. Instead, the number continued to grow. At first, he claimed responsibility for approximately 22 murders. That figure alone would have placed him among the most prolific serial killers in American history. But the confessions did not stop there. As additional interviews were conducted, the number increased again. Eventually, Sells claimed that he had murdered more than 70 people. Such extraordinary statements immediately placed investigators in a difficult position. A confession, by itself, is never enough to close a homicide investigation. Detectives must compare every statement against available evidence, witness testimony, forensic findings, timelines, and documented facts. Serial offenders sometimes confess truthfully. Others exaggerate. Some admit crimes they did not commit in search of attention, notoriety, or psychological control over investigators. Tommy Lynn Sells quickly proved to be a particularly challenging subject because his confessions appeared to contain both truth and contradiction. Investigators could not simply accept every statement at face value, nor could they dismiss them entirely. Instead, each claimed murder required painstaking examination. Law enforcement agencies from multiple states began comparing old case files with Sells' interviews. Detectives reviewed unsolved murders that had occurred during periods when his travels might have placed him in the area. His transient lifestyle suddenly became a crucial part of the investigation. For decades, he had moved throughout the country without maintaining a permanent home. According to the available information, he had traveled through California, Texas, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, Idaho, Utah, Mississippi, Florida, and numerous other states. Temporary jobs, freight trains, hitchhiking, and truck travel allowed him to cover enormous distances. Investigators recognized that many jurisdictions had unknowingly been searching for the same individual without realizing it. Each department had viewed its own homicide as an isolated event. Now those cases had to be re-examined with fresh eyes. Some of Sells' confessions immediately attracted attention because they included details investigators believed were not publicly available. In those instances, detectives considered the possibility that he possessed knowledge only the offender could have known. Such information strengthened confidence that at least some of his admissions reflected genuine involvement. However, other confessions presented significant problems. Certain statements conflicted with physical evidence collected at crime scenes. Timelines failed to align. Some descriptions contradicted known investigative findings. These inconsistencies prevented authorities from confirming every murder Sells claimed as his own. As the investigation expanded, detectives reached a cautious conclusion. Tommy Lynn Sells had almost certainly committed additional murders beyond those for which he was convicted, but the precise number could not be established with certainty. One of the most controversial cases associated with Sells involved the Dardeen family murders in Illinois in 1987. The murders shocked investigators because of their brutality. The victims included Keith Dardeen, his pregnant wife Elaine Dardeen, and their young son. Years later, after his arrest in Texas, Tommy Lynn Sells confessed to committing the crime. On the surface, the confession appeared significant. Investigators always take seriously any admission involving an unsolved homicide, particularly one as notorious as the Dardeen case. Yet as detectives compared Sells' statements with the available evidence, questions began to emerge. Portions of his account failed to correspond with the known facts established during the original investigation. The discrepancies prevented authorities from confidently concluding that the confession was genuine. As a result, the Dardeen murders remain one of the most debated aspects of Tommy Lynn Sells' criminal history. Some investigators considered him a plausible suspect, while others concluded that the available evidence simply did not support a definitive answer. The uncertainty surrounding that case illustrates a broader challenge that affected many aspects of the investigation. Sell's willingness to confess repeatedly complicated rather than simplified the search for truth. Another investigation, frequently discussed, involved Joel Kirkpatrick, along with several additional homicide cases spread across Missouri, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Idaho. As with the Dardenne investigation, detectives compared Sell's statements against existing evidence. In certain instances, portions of his confessions appeared credible. In others, the evidence remained insufficient to establish responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. Investigators therefore distinguished carefully between confirmed crimes, suspected involvement, and unverified confessions. That distinction remains essential when examining Tommy Lynn Sell's legacy because the true extent of his violence has never been conclusively determined. Throughout these investigations, one characteristic consistently separated Sells from many other serial offenders. Most serial killers develop recognizable patterns over time. They may target victims of a particular age, gender, occupation, or appearance. They often remain within familiar geographic areas and repeat similar methods of attack. Tommy Lynn Sells repeatedly defied those expectations. According to investigators, his victims included children, women, men, elderly individuals, and even entire families. His methods varied from case to case. Knives, guns, bats, ropes, and hammers all appeared among the weapons associated with his crimes. Some attacks occurred after nighttime home invasions. Others unfolded under entirely different circumstances. This absence of consistency made it extraordinarily difficult for investigators to identify common threads between cases before his arrest. Even after he confessed, the lack of a clear pattern complicated efforts to verify his claims. Psychological evaluations conducted after his arrest offered additional insight into the man detectives were questioning, although they could never answer every mystery surrounding his behavior. Specialists described severe personality disturbances alongside long-standing alcohol and drug addiction. They also observed what appeared to be an almost complete absence of empathy. During one interview discussed in the available information, Sells reportedly stated that he enjoyed watching the light leave the victim's eyes. The statement reflected an alarming level of emotional detachment and reinforced investigators' belief that he possessed an extraordinary capacity for violence. In another interview with forensic psychiatrist Michael Stone, Sells described himself with a chilling phrase, "I am hatred." He also claimed that he did not understand the meaning of words such as love or sorry and disliked using them altogether. These statements attracted considerable attention because they appeared to illustrate the profound emotional emptiness observed by mental health professionals. Nevertheless, investigators remained focused on evidence rather than psychology alone. Statements made during interviews could help explain aspects of an offender's mindset, but they could never substitute for physical proof linking him to specific crimes. Consequently, every confession required independent verification whenever possible. The more detectives investigated Tommy Lynn Sells' admissions, the more apparent it became that certainty would remain elusive. Some murders could be connected to him with reasonable confidence. Others remained unresolved despite years of examination. Still others appeared increasingly unlikely despite his own claims. The investigation, therefore, evolved into a careful balance between acknowledging what could be proven and recognizing what remained uncertain. Authorities generally concluded that Sells was connected to at least 22 murders, while also recognizing that his own claims of more than 70 victims could neither be fully confirmed nor completely dismissed. This uncertainty distinguishes Tommy Lynn Sells from many other notorious serial killers. In numerous high-profile cases, investigators eventually establish a reasonably accurate victim count based on evidence collected over time. With Sells, that final number remains unknown. His transient lifestyle, inconsistent methods, constantly changing victim profiles and contradictory confessions combined to create one of the most complicated homicide investigations in American history. Each newly examined case carried the possibility of answering old questions while simultaneously raising new ones. For the families of unsolved murder victims, these investigations represented both hope and frustration. A confession might offer the possibility of long-awaited answers, yet uncertainty surrounding its accuracy often prevented definitive closure. In many instances, investigators simply could not reach a conclusion supported by sufficient evidence. The passage of time further complicated those efforts, as physical evidence deteriorated. Witnesses became unavailable, and memories faded. By the time authorities completed years of reviewing Tommy Linsell's claims, one fact remained beyond dispute. The man arrested after the attack in Del Rio was not merely responsible for a single horrific crime. He had become the central figure in a nationwide investigation spanning decades, multiple jurisdictions, and an unknown number of victims. Yet while detectives continued separating truth from exaggeration, the Texas justice system proceeded with the prosecution for the murder that had finally brought his years of freedom to an end. The testimony of one remarkable survivor, the evidence collected after the attack on Katie Harris, and the legal proceedings that followed would ultimately determine Tommy Linsell's fate, bringing his long journey across America to its final destination on death row. By the time Tommy Linsell stood before the Texas justice system, investigators had spent months examining not only the evidence connected to the murder of Kayleen Katie Harris, but also the extraordinary number of confessions he had offered following his arrest. Law enforcement agencies across the United States continued comparing unsolved homicide investigations with his statements, attempting to determine which admissions reflected genuine knowledge and which could not be supported by available evidence. Those broader investigations would continue long after his trial in Texas. The courtroom, however, focused on one specific crime, the attack that occurred during the night of December 31st, 1999, inside the Harris residence in Del Rio. The prosecution's case centered on the evidence gathered after the attack and, most importantly, the testimony of the young survivor whose determination had transformed the investigation. Crystal Searles had endured injuries that should have claimed her life. Instead, she survived, identified her attacker, and became one of the most important witnesses in the entire case. Her courage extended far beyond the events of that New Year's Eve. Surviving a violent crime is only the beginning of a much longer journey. Victims often face years of physical recovery, emotional healing, and the difficult experience of revisiting traumatic memories during criminal proceedings. In Crystal's case, those memories became essential to ensuring that the man responsible for Katie Harris's murder would be held accountable. Her testimony provided the court with the perspective of the only eyewitness who had seen the attacker inside the bedroom that night. The significance of her survival cannot be overstated. Without her, investigators would have faced a crime scene with no living witness capable of describing the intruder. Instead, she provided the information that led to the composite sketch, helped investigators identify Tommy Linsell's, and ultimately stood as a key witness during the legal process. The trial, therefore, became not only a prosecution of the accused, but also a testament to the resilience of a child who had overcome extraordinary circumstances simply to make her voice heard. At the center of the proceedings remained the memory of 13-year-old Katie Harris. While legal arguments necessarily focused on evidence, testimony, and the responsibility of the defendant, the case ultimately concerned the loss of a young life. Katie had been asleep in what should have been the safest place imaginable, her own bedroom, when the attack occurred. She had no opportunity to defend herself against the sudden violence that entered her home. Her death represented an unimaginable loss for her family, who were forced to confront both the tragedy itself and the public attention that followed as investigators uncovered the broader allegations surrounding Tommy Linsell's. The court's responsibility was to determine guilt for the crime supported by the evidence before it. The additional confessions concerning murders in other states remained separate matters requiring independent investigation. Although those admissions influenced public perception of Sells, the Texas proceedings concentrated on the murder of Katie Harris and the attempted murder of Crystal Searles. After considering the evidence presented, the court convicted Tommy Lynn Sells. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Katie Harris. In addition to the death sentence, he also received a life sentence in another case. The convictions brought a measure of legal accountability, yet they did not answer every question investigators had been asking since his arrest. Even as Sells entered death row, detectives across multiple states continued evaluating his confessions, reviewing cold cases, and attempting to establish which murders could be attributed to him with confidence. During the years that followed his conviction, Tommy Lynn Sells remained on death row in Texas. While awaiting execution, he participated in interviews that attracted considerable attention from investigators, journalists, and mental health professionals seeking insight into his behavior. Among the most frequently discussed statements attributed to him was a simple but deeply unsettling declaration made during an interview with forensic psychiatrist Michael Stone. Sells described himself with the words, "I am hatred." The statement reflected the emotional emptiness and hostility that specialists believed characterized his personality. He also reportedly claimed that he did not understand the concepts represented by the words love and sorry, and disliked using either term. Such remarks reinforced the conclusions reached by professionals who had evaluated him. According to the available information, psychiatrists described severe personality disorders, long-standing alcohol and drug addiction, an absence of empathy, and an extreme capacity for violence. These evaluations attempted to explain aspects of his psychological functioning, but they did not alter the legal responsibility established through the judicial process. Throughout his time on death row, the uncertainty surrounding his broader criminal history persisted. Investigators generally believed that Tommy Lynn Sells had been connected to at least 22 murders. At the same time, they remained cautious regarding his repeated claims that the actual number exceeded 50 or even 70 victims. Some confessions contained information that investigators considered highly credible. Others conflicted with established evidence or lacked sufficient corroboration. Consequently, the exact number of people who died at his hands has never been conclusively determined. This unresolved question has become one of the defining characteristics of the Sells case. Unlike many notorious serial murder investigations, in which authorities eventually establish a relatively clear victim count, Tommy Lynn Sells left behind a legacy of uncertainty. Numerous families whose loved ones were victims of unsolved homicides have never received definitive answers regarding whether he was responsible. Some cases remain open to interpretation because evidence supporting or disproving his involvement is incomplete. That uncertainty continues to shape discussions among investigators and criminologists examining his crimes. Eventually, after years of appeals and legal proceedings, the date for Tommy Lynn Sells' execution arrived. On April 3, 2014, he was taken to the Huntsville unit in Texas to receive a lethal injection. Capital punishment represents the final stage of the judicial process, bringing an irreversible conclusion to criminal proceedings after conviction and the exhaustion of available legal remedies. On that day, family members of victims, including Crystal Searles, were present to witness the execution. Their presence reflected the profound and lasting impact the crimes had inflicted. For many survivors and relatives, witnessing the sentence carried out represented an opportunity to observe the completion of a legal process that had begun years earlier with unimaginable violence. Yet even such moments rarely erase grief or restore what has been lost. No court decision can return a murdered child to her family or remove the trauma experienced by those who survived. Before the execution proceeded, officials followed standard procedure by asking Sells whether he wished to make a final statement. Many condemned prisoners choose to address family members, apologize, express remorse, proclaim innocence, or offer final reflections. Tommy Lynn Sells did none of those things. According to the official record, his final response consisted of a single word: no. With that brief answer, he declined the opportunity to make any final remarks. The execution then proceeded by lethal injection. Tommy Lynn Sells was pronounced dead at 6:27 p.m. on April 3, 2014. His death ended the life of a man who had spent decades moving across America under circumstances that allowed him to remain extraordinarily difficult to trace. Yet it did not end the questions surrounding his crimes. Investigators continued examining unresolved cases even after his execution, comparing evidence, reviewing old files, and attempting to determine whether additional murders could be conclusively linked to him. Some questions may never be answered. Physical evidence deteriorates over time. Witnesses become unavailable. Memories fade. In many investigations connected to Sells' confessions, certainty may simply no longer be possible. Because of those limitations, historians and criminologists continue to distinguish carefully between confirmed convictions, probable victims, and allegations that remain unverified. That distinction is essential not only for historical accuracy, but also out of respect for victims and their families, who deserve conclusions based upon evidence rather than speculation. Looking back at the entire case, Tommy Lynn Sells is remembered not because investigators can precisely calculate the number of people he killed, but because his crimes expose significant challenges facing law enforcement during an era when communication between jurisdictions and forensic technology were more limited than they are today. His transient lifestyle, constantly changing methods, absence of a fixed victim profile, and ability to move unnoticed across multiple states made him one of the most difficult violent offenders to identify. At the same time, his eventual capture demonstrated the extraordinary importance of survivors and witnesses in criminal investigations. Had Crystal Searles not survived the attack in Del Rio, the outcome might have been very different. Her courage provided investigators with the critical breakthrough that ended Tommy Lynn Sells' years of freedom. Ultimately, however, the story should never be remembered as the story of a man seeking notoriety through violence. It is the story of lives forever altered by his actions. It is the story of Katie Harris, whose future was stolen in a place where every child should feel safe. It is the story of Crystal Searles, whose determination under unimaginable circumstances helped stop a man investigators believe had spent decades avoiding justice. It is also the story of countless families across America who continue searching for answers in unsolved cases that may never be fully explained. Tommy Lynn Sells sought to leave behind confusion, fear, and unanswered questions. History, however, remembers something far more meaningful: the resilience of survivors, the perseverance of investigators who refuse to abandon difficult cases, and the enduring dignity of the victims whose lives deserve to be remembered long after the man responsible has faded into the past. After Tommy Lynn Sells was executed in 2014, the legal chapter of his life came to an end. The court had delivered its final judgment for the murder of 13-year-old Katie Harris, and the sentence imposed by the state of Texas had been carried out. Yet the investigation surrounding Tommy Lynn Sells never reached the kind of complete conclusion that authorities and families often hope for. His death closed the possibility of further interviews, additional confessions, and future cooperation. It also ensured that some questions surrounding his alleged crimes would remain unanswered forever. The name Tommy Lynn Sells became associated with uncertainty as much as it became associated with violence. Investigators knew that he had committed at least the crimes for which he had been convicted. They also believed that he was responsible for additional murders across multiple states. However, the precise number of victims, the identities of all those victims, and the truth behind every confession remained impossible to establish with complete certainty. That uncertainty is one of the most unusual aspects of the Sells case. Many notorious serial murder investigations eventually produce a clear picture, a known number of victims, a consistent pattern, and a timeline that investigators can reconstruct. Tommy Lynn Sells presented the opposite. His life was defined by movement, instability, and unpredictability. His crimes reflected that same lack of structure. There was no single community where detectives could focus their attention. There was no consistent victim profile that immediately connected separate cases. There was no single method of killing that revealed the same offender again and again. Instead, investigators were left examining fragments of a much larger and darker picture. The phrase coast-to-coast killer came from the belief that Sells' activities extended across a vast portion of the United States. His movements reflected the nickname. He did not remain confined to one region. He traveled through different states, often leaving behind little information about where he had been or where he would go next. His ability to disappear into ordinary society became one of the central reasons he remained unidentified for so long. A person living a conventional life usually leaves behind a predictable trail, a home address, employment records, relationships, neighbors, and routines. Tommy Lynn Sells had very few of these connections. His existence was temporary. He passed through communities rather than becoming part of them. This made him extremely difficult to trace after crimes occurred. For investigators reviewing his history after his arrest, one of the most frustrating aspects was understanding how many opportunities had existed to identify him earlier. The attack on Fabian Witherspoon in 1992 had resulted in his arrest and imprisonment. But at that time, authorities had no confirmed evidence connecting him to a broader series of murders. The crime was prosecuted based on the facts available: a violent assault against a young woman who had survived by fighting back. Without evidence linking him to other crimes, the justice system could not treat him as responsible for offenses that investigators did not yet know existed. After his release, he returned to the same lifestyle that had allowed him to remain hidden for years. He traveled, worked temporary jobs, and continued moving between places. From the perspective of later investigators, those years represented the period when additional crimes may have occurred. But because his movements were so difficult to document, reconstructing his exact timeline became a complicated process. Every confession he offered created new possibilities, but also new challenges. Investigators had to ask the same question repeatedly. Was Tommy Lynn Sells telling the truth? The answer was not always simple. Some offenders confess to crimes they committed because they want to reveal their actions. Others exaggerate because they want attention or because they enjoy controlling the investigation. In Sells' case, authorities discovered evidence of both credibility and contradiction. Certain statements included details that appeared meaningful and consistent with known facts. Other statements could not be verified or conflicted with evidence already collected. This mixture made him a difficult source of information. He was both a potential key to solving cold cases and an unreliable narrator of his own history. The murder of the Dardine family in Illinois became one of the clearest examples of this problem. Tommy Lynn Sells claimed responsibility for the killings years after the crime occurred. For investigators and the public, such a confession naturally attracted attention. An unsolved murder involving multiple victims appeared to have a possible answer. However, when detectives examined the details, questions emerged. Some parts of his account did not align with known evidence. Without sufficient confirmation, authorities could not definitively attribute the crime to him. The case remains one of the many examples where suspicion exists, but certainty does not. For the families affected by unsolved murders, this distinction is painful but necessary. A confession may create hope, but only evidence can provide a true conclusion. The same issue affected other cases that investigators reviewed after Sells' arrest. Across several states, authorities examined whether his movements and statements matched unsolved homicides. Some investigations produced stronger connections than others. Some remained unresolved. Each case required careful consideration rather than assumption. The passage of time created additional obstacles. Evidence that might have been available years earlier could be incomplete or unavailable. Witness memories could fade. Records from decades before might not contain the information modern investigators would hope to find. The result was a complicated picture in which some victims could potentially be connected to cells, while others remained surrounded by uncertainty. From a criminological perspective, Tommy Lynn cells represented an unusual type of offender. His lack of consistency challenged traditional approaches to profiling serial killers. Many offenders reveal themselves through repetition. They return to familiar methods because those methods provide psychological satisfaction or because they become part of their personal rituals. Cells, however, appeared far more adaptable. He did not restrict himself to a specific category of victim. He did not rely on one weapon. He did not operate within one geographical area. This flexibility made him dangerous because investigators had fewer recognizable patterns to analyze. His crimes appeared random, and randomness is one of the greatest challenges in criminal investigation. When there is no obvious connection between victims, law enforcement must search through enormous amounts of information before identifying possible links. The Cells case also demonstrated the importance of cooperation between different law enforcement agencies. After his arrest, investigators from multiple states began sharing information and comparing cases. This process revealed how many crimes might have remained isolated without a central suspect. Connecting them, the investigation became a nationwide effort rather than a single department's responsibility. It showed both the difficulties of investigating crimes across jurisdictions and the importance of collaboration when dealing with offenders who move constantly. However, even the strongest cooperation cannot overcome the absence of evidence. Investigators could not simply assign every unsolved murder to Tommy Lynn Cells because he claimed responsibility. Doing so would risk creating false conclusions and potentially ignoring the real offenders responsible for those crimes. Therefore, authorities maintained a careful approach, separating confirmed cases from suspected ones. This approach protected the integrity of investigations and respected the victims whose stories deserved accuracy rather than speculation. The psychological profile of Tommy Lynn Cells also remained a subject of discussion after his death. Mental health professionals who evaluated him described serious personality disturbances, addiction problems, and a lack of empathy. His own statements suggested a disturbing emotional detachment from the suffering he caused. Yet psychological explanations could never provide complete answers. Understanding a person's background or mental state does not erase personal responsibility for violent choices. The victims of Tommy Lynn Cells were not symbols in a psychological case study. They were individuals with families, memories, and futures that were taken away. Any examination of his life must ultimately return to the people affected by his crimes. The most important figures in this story are not the investigators, the media, or even the offender himself. They are the victims. Katie Harris was a 13-year-old girl whose life ended during a violent attack inside her own home. Crystal Searles was a 10-year-old survivor whose courage became the key to stopping the man responsible. Fabian Witherspoon was a young woman whose determination allowed her to survive an assault years earlier. And beyond those known names were many other individuals whose lives may have been connected to Cells, as well as families who continue to search for answers. Tommy Lynn Cells died without revealing the full truth behind every claim he made. Whether his statement that he killed more than 70 people was accurate, exaggerated, or a combination of both may never be known. What remains is a record of confirmed crimes, disputed confessions, and unanswered questions that continue to surround his name. The case of Tommy Lynn Cells stands as a reminder that some investigations do not end with perfect clarity. Sometimes justice arrives without every mystery being solved. Sometimes families receive accountability, but not every answer they deserve. And sometimes the final truth is limited by the evidence left behind. The story of the coast-to-coast killer is therefore not only about a man who avoided detection for years. It is about the challenges of understanding crimes that cross boundaries, the importance of survivors who refuse to be silenced, and the responsibility of remembering victims whose lives cannot be reduced to statistics. Even after the final court decision and the final execution, the search for truth remains a process shaped by evidence, patience, and respect for those who suffered. When discussions about Tommy Lynn Sells begin, the focus often turns toward the man himself. His movements across America, his confessions, his criminal history, and the unanswered questions surrounding the number of people he may have killed. Yet behind every investigation file, every courtroom proceeding, and every statistic are individual human beings whose lives were changed forever. The true measure of this case cannot be found only in the number of crimes attributed to Tommy Lynn Sells. It must also be understood through the experiences of the victims, the families who lost loved ones, and the survivors who carried the weight of unimaginable memories. The danger of focusing too heavily on an offender is that the people harmed by his actions can become secondary figures in their own stories. In the case of Tommy Lynn Sells, the victims were not simply names connected to an investigation. They were children, parents, family members, and individuals with their own hopes, relationships, and futures. Their lives existed long before the crimes that brought them into public attention, and their identities deserve to remain at the center of the story. Among the victims most closely associated with Tommy Lynn Sells is Kayleen Katie Harris, the 13-year-old girl whose murder eventually led to his capture. The events of December 31st, 1999, are remembered because of the violence that occurred inside her home. But the tragedy is not defined only by how she died. It is also defined by who she was before that night. Katie was a child at the beginning of her life, a young person who should have had years ahead of her to grow, learn, experience new opportunities, and build memories with her family. Instead, her life ended during a crime committed by a stranger who entered the place where she should have been safest. The loss experienced by Katie's family cannot be measured by legal documents or courtroom decisions. A conviction can establish responsibility. An execution can bring a legal conclusion, but neither can restore the person who was taken away. For families affected by violent crime, justice often exists alongside permanent grief. They may receive answers about what happened, but they must still live with the absence created by the crime. Katie Harris's name remains connected to the case because of the role her death played in exposing Tommy Lynn Sells. But she was far more than a victim in an investigation. She was a daughter, a family member, and a young person whose future was stolen. Beside Katie's story stands the remarkable survival of Crystal Searles. At only 10 years old, she experienced an attack that few people could imagine surviving. The injuries she suffered were life-threatening, yet she managed to escape the home and seek help. Her actions changed the entire course of the investigation. Without her survival and her ability to describe the attacker, Tommy Lynn Sells might have continued moving across the country unidentified. However, focusing only on her importance as a witness risks overlooking the personal reality of what she endured. Crystal was not simply the person who helped solve a crime. She was a child who experienced extreme violence and then faced the difficult process of recovery. Survival does not mean that a person escapes unharmed. Physical injuries may heal, but traumatic experiences can leave lasting effects. Crystal's courage was demonstrated not only in the moments immediately after the attack, but also in her willingness to participate in the legal process that followed. She carried the burden of confronting the person responsible and providing testimony about one of the most painful experiences of her life. Her role in the case became a symbol of resilience. But behind that symbol was a young survivor forced to face circumstances no child should ever experience. The story of Fabian Witherspoon also illustrates the importance of remembering victims and survivors beyond the criminal acts committed against them. In 1992, Fabian encountered Tommy Lynn Sells after seeing him asking for food and offering to work in exchange for assistance. Her decision to help him was motivated by compassion. She saw someone who appeared to need support and responded with kindness. That act of generosity became the beginning of a violent encounter when Sells attacked her inside her home. Yet Fabian's story is not only about what was done to her. It is also about her determination to survive. During the attack, she fought back with extraordinary courage. She used whatever means were available to resist, ultimately injuring Sells and creating the opportunity for his arrest. Her actions interrupted his ability to continue the assault and demonstrated remarkable strength. Under terrifying circumstances, like Crystal, Fabian became a survivor whose actions had consequences beyond her own immediate safety. Her survival temporarily removed Tommy Lynn Sells from society when he was arrested and imprisoned. Years later, investigators would recognize the importance of that event because it represented one of the few times when his violence was directly confronted by someone who lived. Beyond these known survivors and victims, the larger investigation surrounding Tommy Lynn Sells raised questions about many other individuals whose cases may or may not have been connected to him. Investigators believed he was responsible for at least 22 murders, but his own claims of more than 70 victims could never be fully confirmed. This uncertainty leaves many families in a difficult position. Some may wonder whether the person responsible for their loved one's death was ever identified. Others may have received partial answers without complete certainty. The investigation into Tommy Lynn Sells created possibilities for resolution, but it also highlighted the painful reality that not every case can be conclusively solved. For families of missing or murdered individuals, uncertainty can be its own form of suffering. Knowing that a person may have been responsible is different from having evidence strong enough to establish the truth in court. Investigators must follow proof, not assumptions. This careful approach protects the accuracy of criminal investigations, but it can also mean that some families continue waiting for answers. The victims connected to the Sells investigation came from different backgrounds and different circumstances. One of the characteristics that made Sells difficult to trace was his lack of a consistent victim profile. He did not limit himself to one group of people. The victims associated with him included children, women, men, elderly individuals, and entire families. This unpredictability meant that the people affected by his crimes could not easily be connected through traditional investigative patterns. It also meant that every victim represented a separate tragedy with its own history and its own grieving family. The absence of a clear pattern should never create the impression that the victims were random or insignificant. Each person had a life that mattered. Each loss created consequences that extended beyond the crime scene. Families, friends, and communities were changed permanently by what happened. When investigators examine serial crimes, they often study patterns, methods, and offender behavior because those elements help identify suspects. But the human cost exists outside those analytical categories. A victim is never simply a number in a database or a detail in a case file. Remembering victims requires looking beyond the circumstances of their deaths and recognizing their humanity. The case of Tommy Lynn Sells also demonstrates the importance of survivors in criminal justice. Without people like Crystal Searles and Fabian Witherspoon, investigators might not have had the information necessary to stop him. Survivors often become central figures in legal proceedings, but their importance extends beyond their testimony. They represent the possibility that even after experiencing devastating harm, individuals can continue forward. Their stories are not defined only by what happened to them. They are also defined by their strength afterward. However, even as survivors demonstrate incredible resilience, Society must remember that the responsibility for violence belongs entirely to the person who commits it. Acts of kindness, trust, or vulnerability by victims never create responsibility for the harm done to them. Fabian's decision to help someone in need was an expression of compassion. Katie and Crystal were children who deserved safety. The victims of Tommy Lynn's cells did not cause the violence inflicted upon them. The responsibility belonged solely to the offender who chose to commit those acts. As years pass, the name Tommy Lynn Cells may continue to appear in discussions of criminal history because of the mystery surrounding his possible victims and the difficulty of investigating his crimes. But the lasting memory of this case should not be centered on the person who caused suffering. It should be centered on those whose lives were affected, the families who continue remembering loved ones, the survivors who found the strength to continue, the investigators who worked to uncover the truth, and the victims whose stories deserve to be told with dignity and respect. The final chapter of Tommy Lynn Cell's life ended in 2014, but the stories of those affected by his crimes continue. Justice concluded in a courtroom, but remembrance continues beyond it. In the end, the most important legacy of this case is not the mystery of how many crimes one man committed. It is the reminder that behind every investigation are human lives, and those lives deserve to be remembered long after the headlines disappear.